You've held a phone that changed everything, but you've never seen it happen to someone on live television. Steve Harvey was in the middle of a sentence. His mouth was open. His hand was raised. The audience was laughing at something he'd said about a contestant's answer. And then, a man walked onto the stage. Not from the wings where the families enter, from behind camera 3, where the producers sit. The man was wearing a headset around his neck and holding a cell phone with both hands like it was made of glass. He walked directly to Steve Harvey, and he did not wait for the laughter to stop. He held the phone out. Steve looked at the phone. He looked at the man. And then, Steve Harvey's face did something that no one in that studio, not the crew, not the families, not the 400 people in the audience, had ever seen it do. His jaw locked. His eyes went wide, and then narrow, and then wide again in the space of a single second. His hand reached for the phone, and his fingers closed around it, and he brought it to his ear, and he turned away from the audience. His shoulders curved inward. His free hand came up and pressed flat against his forehead. And the studio fell completely silent. Because 400 people had just watched the funniest man on television become someone they did not recognize. The contestant, standing at the podium, was a woman named Margaret Su. She was 41 years old. She was a pediatric physical therapist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She had been standing at the buzzer waiting for Steve to read the next question. And now she was watching the host of the show press a phone to his ear and fold in on himself like a man who had just been punched in the chest. But to understand the phone call, you have to understand Margaret. Margaret Su was born on August 19, 1980, in Norristown, Pennsylvania, to James and Young Hee Su. James was a second-generation Korean-American who drove a delivery truck for a bakery distributor. Young Hee had come to the United States from Busan in 1974, and she worked as a seamstress in a garment shop on North Broad Street in Philadelphia for 31 years. Between them, they made $52,000 a year. They raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom house with 1 bathroom. Margaret was the middle child. Her older brother Daniel had been born with cerebral palsy. He could not walk. He could not dress himself. He could speak slowly, with effort, and what he said was almost always kind. Daniel was the reason Margaret became a physical therapist. She watched her mother carry Daniel up and down the stairs of that 2-bedroom house every day for 18 years. Young Hee weighed 112 pounds, and Daniel weighed 140 by the time he was 16. And Margaret decided when she was 11 years old that she would spend her life helping children like her brother move through a world that was not built for them. She graduated from Temple University in 2002. She completed her doctorate in physical therapy at Drexel in 2005. She took a job at Children's Hospital making $61,000 a year. She worked with children who had spinal cord injuries, cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, traumatic brain injuries. She worked with children who would never walk, and she worked with children who walked again, and she gave the same amount of herself to both. Daniel died on November 3, 2016. He was 39 years old. The cause was aspiration pneumonia, a common complication for adults with severe cerebral palsy. He died at home, in the bedroom he had slept in his entire life, with Young Hee holding his left hand and Margaret holding his right. James was in the hallway. He could not go in. He stood with his back against the wall and his hands at his sides, and he stared at a spot on the carpet, and he did not move for 45 minutes after his son stopped breathing. Margaret did not take a single day off work. She went back to Children's Hospital the Monday after Daniel's funeral, and she walked into the therapy room, and she worked with a 6-year-old girl named Destiny, who had a C5 spinal cord injury. and she helped Destiny grip a rubber ball for the first time. And when Destiny squeezed the ball and laughed, Margaret smiled at her and said, "Look at you, superstar." And then Margaret walked into the supply closet and pressed her face into a stack of folded towels, and her whole body shook without making a sound. She told her parents she was fine. That was the lie. She told them the hospital had a grief counselor, and she was seeing the counselor every week. She was not. She told them she was sleeping. She was not. She lay awake in her apartment in West Philadelphia until 2 or 3 in the morning, and she stared at the ceiling, and she ran through every therapy session she had ever done with Daniel, every stretch, every range of motion exercise, every hour she spent trying to strengthen the muscles in his legs that would never carry him, and she asked herself whether she had done enough, whether she had missed something, whether the girl who decided at 11 years old to fix children like her brother had failed the first child she ever loved. Her younger sister Grace noticed. Grace was 29 and lived in New York, and she called Margaret every Wednesday evening. In February of 2017, Grace called and Margaret answered, and Grace said, "Tell me one thing you did this week that wasn't work." Margaret was quiet for 9 seconds. Grace counted. Then Margaret said, "I bought shampoo." Grace booked a train ticket to Philadelphia that night. Grace was the one who signed the family up for Family Feud. She did it in June of 2021. She told Margaret it was because their mother had always loved the show, which was true. Young Hee watched it every evening at 7 p.m. and shouted answers at the screen in a mix of Korean and English that made the whole family laugh. But Grace did it because she believed Margaret needed something. Not therapy, not advice, not another person telling her to take care of herself. Something joyful, something ridiculous, something that had nothing to do with hospital rooms. The Su family arrived at the studio in Atlanta on February 17, 2022. Margaret, Grace, their cousin Kevin, their aunt Patricia, and Young Hee. Young Hee was 71 years old, and she had never been on an airplane before. She gripped the armrest during takeoff so hard that her knuckles turned white, and Margaret covered her mother's hand with her own and said, "I've got you, Oma." They wore matching navy blue shirts with the word "Su" printed across the back in white letters. James did not come. He had been diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer in September of 2021. He was undergoing chemotherapy at Penn Medicine. He was too weak to travel. He had lost 34 pounds. He told Margaret he would watch the episode when it aired, and he would yell answers at the TV, just like Young Hee. He told her to win. He told her to make him proud. Margaret did not tell Steve Harvey any of this. She did not tell the producers. On the application under "Anything you'd like us to know about your family," Grace had written, "Our mother has watched this show every night for 30 years, and she has never been more excited about anything in her life." That was all. The first round went smoothly. The Sus played against the Baxter family from Nashville. Kevin won the face-off. The family played. They got the first 2 answers wrong, and Margaret stepped up for the third and said, "Alarm clock," for "Name something that wakes you up in the morning." And it was the #1 answer, and Young Hee screamed so loud from the end of the podium that Steve Harvey turned and looked at her and said, "Ma'am, I think they heard you in the parking lot." And Young Hee put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes crinkled, and the audience laughed, and for 30 seconds everything was perfect. They cleared the board. They won the round. Steve was setting up round 2. Margaret was at the podium for the face-off. Steve had the question card in his hand. And then the producer walked out from behind camera 3. The man's name was David Calloway. He had been a producer on Family Feud for 9 years. In those 9 years, He had never once walked onto the stage during a taping. Not during technical difficulties. Not during medical incidents. Not during anything. There were protocols for interruptions, and none of them involved the senior producer walking directly to the host in the middle of a live audience taping. David Calloway walked to Steve and held out the phone. Steve looked at him. David said something, just a few words close to Steve's ear, too quiet for the boom microphones. And Steve took the phone. He brought it to his ear and he turned away from the cameras. His left hand went to his forehead. He was quiet for a long time. 10 seconds. 15. Then he said, "Yes, sir." And then he said, "I will." And then he said, "You hold on, you hear me?" His voice cracked on the word, "hold." He pulled the phone away from his ear, and he pressed it against his chest, and he closed his eyes, and the studio fell completely silent. Margaret was watching from the podium. She did not understand. None of the contestants understood. The audience was frozen. 400 people holding their breath, watching Steve Harvey stand with a phone pressed to his chest and his eyes shut on a game show stage. Steve opened his eyes. He turned around. He looked at Margaret. "Margaret," he said, "this phone call is for you." Margaret's face went white. Not pale, white. The blood left her face so fast that Grace, standing 3 positions down at the family podium, took a step toward her. "Your father is on this phone," Steve said. Margaret's hand came off the buzzer and went to her mouth. Her knees bent, not buckling, just softening, the way a person's body gives when it receives something it was not prepared to hold. Steve walked toward her. He held the phone out. "Your father called the show," Steve said. "He called the main number. He talked to 4 different people to get through. He's at the hospital. He told my producer that he promised he would watch you play, and he intends to keep that promise." The studio fell completely silent. So silent that when Margaret took the phone and brought it to her ear, every person in the first 6 rows could hear the faint, thin sound of a man's voice coming through the speaker. "Appa," Margaret said, and then she could not say anything else. She stood at that podium with the phone pressed to her ear and tears pouring down her face, and she listened. She listened for almost 2 minutes. The cameras kept rolling. Steve stood beside her with his hand on her back. He did not rush her. He did not speak. A camera operator on the right side of the stage would later say that 4 crew members behind the rigs were crying, and that one sound technician had to take off his headphones and step away because he could not keep his composure. When Margaret finally lowered the phone, she wiped her face with both hands and took a breath that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and ancient. "My father wants me to win," she said. Steve took the phone from her gently. He brought it to his own ear. "Mr. Su," Steve said, "my name is Steve Harvey, and I give you my word. Your daughter is about to make you the proudest man alive." He handed the phone back to David Calloway. He turned to the audience. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home right now," Steve said. "That man is in a hospital bed. He is fighting cancer. He cannot be here. But he picked up that phone, and he called this show, and he talked to 4 people until somebody listened, because he made a promise to his daughter. That is what a father does. You don't stop being a father because you're sick. You don't stop being a father because you're tired. You don't stop." He looked at Margaret. "Your father just carried you across that stage from a hospital bed." 5 words surfaced in his voice, almost whispered, almost prayer. "Carried you from the bed." Margaret closed her eyes, and her chest heaved once, and she bit down on her bottom lip, and she nodded. Young He was weeping at the end of the podium, both hands pressed flat against her face. Grace had her arm around her mother's shoulders. But Steve wasn't done. He looked at the Baxter family across the stage. Tom Baxter, the father, a plumber from Nashville, was standing at his podium with tears in his eyes. His wife, Linda, had her hand on his arm. "Tom," Steve said, "you got anything you want to say?" Tom Baxter cleared his throat. He looked at Margaret. He looked at young He. He said, "My father passed from cancer in 2018. I know what that phone call meant." He paused. "We want to play the game. We want to play it hard, because that man on the phone told his daughter to win, and she deserves an opponent worth beating." The audience erupted. Margaret looked at Tom Baxter, and she mouthed the words, "Thank you," and Tom nodded once. But Steve wasn't done. They played round 2. Margaret hit the buzzer first. Steve read the question. "Name something a parent says to a child every day." Margaret did not hesitate. She said, "I'm proud of you." It was the number 1 answer. The board lit up. Margaret turned toward camera 2, the camera that was recording to tape, the camera whose footage her father would watch from his hospital bed, and she pointed at it. She pointed straight at the lens and she said, "That's for you, Appa." They played round 3 and round 4. The Sus won both. The score was not close. The Baxters played hard and they played honestly, and the Sus were better that day. And when Steve announced the final round was over, Tom Baxter walked across the stage and hugged Margaret and said, "Your dad raised a fighter." They went to Fast Money, Margaret and Grace. Margaret went first and she scored 189 points. Grace went second. She needed 11 points. She scored 43. The total was 232. The board lit up, and the number $20,000 appeared, and the Su family screamed, and young He dropped to her knees on the stage. Literally dropped. And Margaret knelt beside her and held her mother, and the studio fell completely silent for one final breath before the noise rose and filled every corner of that room. Steve walked over one last time. He knelt beside Margaret and young He on the stage floor. "You call your father tonight," Steve said. "You tell him the Su family won, and you tell him I said he already won a long time ago." The episode aired on March 22, 2022. Within 8 hours, the clip of Steve handing Margaret the phone had 6.1 million views on YouTube. Within 4 days, it reached 28 million. It trended on every major social media platform. ABC News, CBS Mornings, and the BBC all covered the story. The clip was shared by 14 verified accounts with more than 1 million followers each. But the numbers were not the point. The phone call was the point. 3 weeks after the taping, James Su's oncologist reported that his tumor had responded to the latest round of chemotherapy better than any prior round. James gained 4 pounds. He started walking to the mailbox again. He told Kang Hee, his morning nurse, that he needed to get strong because his daughter won $20,000 and he intended to help her spend it. 3 months later, Margaret used a portion of the winnings, along with $34,000 raised through a GoFundMe that Grace had started without telling her, to launch the Daniel Su Mobility Fund, named for her brother. The fund provides adaptive equipment, wheelchairs, standing frames, gait trainers, to families of children with cerebral palsy who cannot afford them. In its first year, the fund provided equipment to 61 children in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. The youngest recipient was 14 months old. A year after the episode aired, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from Destiny, the girl with the C5 spinal cord injury, the girl who had squeezed the rubber ball the Monday after Daniel's funeral. Destiny was now 12 years old. She was in the 6th grade. She was writing with a pencil gripped in a hand that Margaret had helped her learn to use. The letter was 4 sentences long. The last sentence said, "You are my superstar too, Mrs. Su." Margaret framed it. It hangs on the wall of her therapy room at Children's Hospital, next to a photograph of Daniel. Today, James Su is 74 years old. His cancer is in remission. He watches Family Feud every evening at 7 p.m., just like young he. They sit in the living room in Norristown in matching recliners that the children bought them with part of the winnings. James still yells answers at the television. He is right about 60% of the time. Young he is right about 75%, and she does not let him forget it. Margaret still works at Children's Hospital. She still arrives at 7 a.m. and leaves at 6 p.m., and she still calls every child superstar. She sleeps now, most nights. On the wall backstage at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta, next to a photograph of an elderly man in a charcoal suit with both fists raised, there is a newer photograph. It shows Margaret Su kneeling on the stage floor beside her mother, both of them crying, the phone still in Margaret's right hand. Someone on the crew wrote beneath it in silver marker, "He called 4 times. A phone is just a phone. A voice through a speaker is just sound and signal and wire. But when a dying man picks up that phone and calls a television show and asks 4 strangers to let him hear his daughter play, that phone becomes something else. It becomes the last distance a father is willing to cross. It becomes proof that love does not need legs, does not need strength, does not need anything at all except the stubbornness to show up in whatever way is left." Subscribe now so you never miss the moments that remind you what matters. Share this with someone who needs to call the person they love today. Not tomorrow, today. And leave a comment below telling us about the promise someone kept for you. Because those promises are what hold this world together.